This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson, and in the early hours of Saturday, the 1st of December, these are our main stories. World leaders are gathered in Buenos Aires facing challenges over climate change, the US-China trade war, and the murder of a Saudi journalist. A Chinese man who wrongly spent more than 2 decades on death row has been released. Also in this podcast. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow, 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 follow the yellow brick road. Why The Wizard of Oz has been named the most influential film of all time. In the Argentine capital, some of the world's most powerful leaders and bank governors are meeting for the 10th annual G20 summit. Every interaction, handshake and conversation is being closely analysed by diplomats, delegates and the media as presidents and prime ministers navigate their way through the choppy waters of international geopolitics. Opening the summit, the Argentine president Mauricio Macri called for dialogue and consensus to address the challenges of the future.
Nosotros tenemos la obligación de mostrarle al mundo.
It is our duty to show to the world that today global challenges require global responses. Problems such as the future of work or climate change are issues that we can't resolve on our own. So I would like to invite us all to work together.
On the agenda, not only climate change, but trade and international relations. Yet it's what's off the agenda that's sure to raise the most interest, such as Donald Trump and the Chinese premier meeting to discuss the current trade war. Our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, is in Buenos Aires.
The discussions they're having have been over, Russia's involvement in Ukraine, the seizure of the Ukrainian vessels. That has been on the agenda today. The whole issue of trade, not just the trade war between the United States and China, which, as you say, is going to be part of a key meeting between President Trump and President Xi tomorrow, but also the wider issues about protectionism that is expanding across the international trading system. Obviously, there's been discussion about Saudi Arabia and the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. This is the first time that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been on the international stage.
Mauricio Macri has called for unity and for the leaders to work together. Is that really possible?
Well, no, I think there is a real question mark about these summits now, about their purpose, about what they can achieve, because this particular summit, the G20, became a sort of a summit of world leaders 10 years ago when they came together to try and tackle the global financial crisis. And that was a time when they did show a degree of unity in the face of a common threat. Since then, that has begun to break down. And we see today that instead of them actually coming to joint positions on migration, on climate change, on world trade, instead there are profound differences between many of these leaders and the way they view the world. And I think that will be very hard for the summit organisers to paper over when they get to the communique. And there's already talk that yet again this might be another global summit where a communique becomes impossible to achieve.
James Landale in Buenos Aires. There's one particular issue, one man who's also high on the unofficial agenda, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. He arrived at the event as the international community continued to wrestle with how to react to the killing of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. Our Arab Affairs editor, Sebastian Usher, told me more about how other leaders received the Saudi prince.
The image which has gone viral is the one of President Putin glad-handing the Crown Prince. But that came after the group photo in which it was very clear that the Crown Prince was being put to the extreme edge of the frame of that picture, away from where all the other main leaders were and very far on the other side from where his main tormentor is, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's had a number of hushed and brief conversations with other leaders, with President Trump, and with the French president, Emmanuel Macron. That was an interesting conversation, very brief, but bits minutes were actually caught on tape, in which Macron essentially seems to be telling him, you've got to have a full investigation here. And the Crown Prince seems to be reassuring him, saying it's all right, it's okay, I've got it under control. And the French president not sounding too sure about that. So at the moment, not very committal, but he certainly hasn't been snubbed. This isn't a massive diplomatic show that he's a pariah. We'll have to see how it goes in the coming day or two.
Sebastian Usher. A Chinese man has had his murder conviction quashed after spending 23 years in jail. Jin Zhihong, who's been facing the death sentence, was freed after a dogged campaign by his son. Our Asia-Pacific editor Celia Hatton reports.
Jin Zhihong has spent more than half his life in prison for a murder he confessed to in 1995. He's always maintained that the police tortured him into admitting that he killed 20-year-old Li Yi, a woman found buried near Mr. Jin's village in northeast China's Jilin province. The case was always shaky. There were no witnesses, no weapon, and no motive. The entire investigation rested on Mr. Jin's initial questionable confession. 4 times the court heard Jin Zhihong's case, and 4 times it sentenced him to death, then commuted the sentence to life in prison on appeal. Stories like this one have been cropping up more and more in China. In 2015, the Supreme Court vowed to re-examine death row cases that relied solely on a suspect's possibly faulty confession. This story has a bittersweet ending. Jin Zhihong's son was 2 years old when his father was arrested. Now 25, he led the campaign for one last retrial. He told the Chinese media that he'd only ever seen his father for 20-minute visits. In total, he estimates they've spent less than 4 hours of their lives together. Now frail, Jin Zhihong was brought to hear today's verdict in a wheelchair. He sobbed as the court finally set him free.
Celia Hatton. A man known as the Defender of Srebrenica has been acquitted of war crimes in Bosnia. Nasser Oric commanded the Bosnian Muslim forces in the enclave during the conflict of the 1990s. He was accused of murdering ethnic Serb prisoners of war. The Bosnian War Crimes Court acquitted him last year, but the prosecution appealed. Our Balkans correspondent Guy Delaunay has been following the case.
To these people, the verdict was vindication for a hero. Nasser Oric organised the defence of Srebrenica. His forces held out for 3 years before Bosnian Serbs overran the supposed safe haven in 1995, killing 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys. But Mr. Oric was a controversial figure. Prosecutors said he'd been responsible for the murder of ethnic Serb prisoners, and at the Hague Tribunal, a UN commander described the Srebrenica massacre as retaliation for attacks by Mr. Oric's troops. In court in Sarajevo, the judge said the prosecution's key witness was unreliable. The Mothers of Srebrenica group labelled the trial a circus and called on prosecutors to stop arresting people who survived genocide.
Guy Delaunay. To South Sudan now, where the aid agency Doctors Without Borders says 125 women and girls have been raped in the past 10 days while attempting to get emergency food. Our reporter Farhana Dawood has been looking at what happened.
This happened in Bentiu in South Sudan. This is a town where it's one of the worst hit towns in the civil war. These women and girls, some of them over the age of 65, girls as young as 10, have been seeking food and been coming under attack. They've been being raped, beaten and robbed. The attackers are even taking away what little possessions they have, including the ration cards that they need to get food. MSF, the Doctors Without Borders agency, is truly shocked by this, and they have been in South Sudan for many years dealing with the outfall from the civil war. Here is what Mitchell Sangba, the MSF medical coordinator in Juba, had to say.
What we understand is that there's a large group of aggressive assailants are brutalizing and assaulting women and girls. The assailants are armed, masked, the majority is in civilian clothing. And of course, some of them were also reported to be wearing camouflage clothes or wearing uniforms.
A horrific story. Why would these young men do this?
Well, we don't know. I mean, the agency doesn't really know. But what we must say is that local officials dispute MSF's account. South Sudan has been ravaged by civil war over the past 5 years. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, around 4 million people displaced. Rape and sexual violence has unfortunately been quite prominent in that civil war. But this particular rise, this alarming rise, has even shocked people from MSF who are working there on the ground.
Farhana Dawood. An American police officer who shot an innocent black man in his own home has been charged with murder. Amber Geiger, who's white, reportedly thought she was in her flat when she killed Botham Jean. Charlotte Gallagher reports.
In September this year, Botham Jean was at home in Dallas when Amber Geiger walked in. Apparently thinking she was in her own apartment and that Botham Jean was an intruder, Miss Geiger shot him. She was originally charged with manslaughter, but now a grand jury has decided that Amber Geiger should go on trial for murder. The decision was welcomed by Mr. Jean's family, who'd campaigned for the officer to face a murder charge, but they said the shooting should never have happened in the first place.
Botham was a very good young man. We've all heard the great things about Botham and all the things that he had accomplished and would have accomplished. The family have a lot of places that they would want to be on this very day. One of the places is not right here today talking to the media.
The mayor of Dallas described Mr. Jean as a model citizen. A state funeral was held for him on the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, where he grew up. The killing of Botham Jean was seen by many as another example of US police officers targeting unarmed black men. His family's lawyer told reporters that black people in America have been killed by police in some of the most unbelievable manners. In the last few weeks, 2 other innocent black men have been shot dead after officers mistakenly thought they'd committed a crime.
Charlotte Gallagher. Still to come in this podcast, it's emerged that the president of a popular gay dating app doesn't believe in gay marriage. A human rights organisation in Iran says government authorities have detained the lawyer Amir Salah Davoudi, who represents political activists. He's the latest lawyer to have been detained in recent months. Some have been jailed and even flogged. I spoke to Kasra Naji from our Persian service about the Davoudi case.
He's a particularly brave lawyer, it seems, having defended teachers, activists, union activists, Kurdish insurgents, people who are in jail, sentenced to execution. He's been defending political prisoners, and he's been vocal in terms of criticizing the corruption, as he calls it, in the judiciary. In Iran, doing this kind of thing is pretty dangerous work.
This sounds quite an unusual situation. In most countries, the lawyers are they represent all sorts of people, but they're not seen as being associated with that cause. And the idea of lawyers being beaten will sound very strange to a lot of people hearing this.
Iranian judiciary is very, very strange. There are no rules and regulations governing sentencing or governing the work of lawyers. And only recently, the judiciary came up with this very strange decision that only 20 lawyers, chosen lawyers, are allowed to represent prisoners who are accused of security charges, as they call it.
What is likely to happen next to Amir Salah Davoudi?
We know that he was picked up about 10 days ago and he's taken to somewhere we don't know where. Apparently, he was allowed to make 2 contacts, telephone contacts with his families. The families, we understand, have been told by security forces not to publicize the case. So we don't know why he has been picked up. But given the fact that he's been pretty vocal and brave in defending these kind of clients, I suppose the people in the judiciary, some people in the judiciary and in the security services in Iran basically didn't like what he was doing. And often in these cases, charges are framed afterwards, and often they are charges like acting against national security.
Kasra Naji from our Persian service. The president of the predominantly gay international networking app Grindr says he supports the view that marriage is a holy union between a man and a woman. The BBC's Gareth Barlow has the details.
It's one of the most popular networking apps on the planet, helping, according to its website, gay, bi, trans and queer people make connections around the world. But despite claiming to proudly represent a modern LGBTQ lifestyle, the company's president, Scott Chen, has said he supports the view that marriage is a holy union between a man and a woman. Writing in Chinese in a now deleted Facebook post, Mr. Chen said marriage is a personal issue, your own business. Responding to criticism, the Grindr president defended his stance on gay rights, saying he supported gay marriage and that his views were based on his own relationship with his wife. Zach Stafford, Grindr's chief content officer, said the comments weren't representative of the app's values. Grindr, he said, was seeking to help the full equality of all LGBT people's rights. But they will undoubtedly be hurtful to a community for whom marriage is legal in fewer than 30 countries worldwide. Yet apart from the PR palaver, the comments are unlikely to deter people from using the app, to make new connections and maybe to begin a new marriage.
Gareth Barlow. Now to New Zealand, where 51 whales have died after becoming stranded on a beach on the Chatham Islands off the country's east coast. Only a few days ago, more than 140 pilot whales died in another mass stranding in New Zealand. My colleague Nuala McGovern has been talking to Professor David Lusseau from Aberdeen University. He's witnessed the stranding of a whale and says it's heartbreaking.
Oh, it's gut-wrenching. It's really gut-wrenching. For so many reasons, it's a waste of life. The animals suffer, for prolonged periods. For those that were not sick when they stranded, or even if they were sick, if it took them a while to die. It's really tough. And so I've been to attend the live stranding for a single individual only, and just being there for when the animal died was very tough.
Yeah, and these stories we're hearing, now we're hearing of mass strandings, meaning more than
Correct.
200 whales have died in separate incidents over the past week. Now, the region we're talking about is in New Zealand specifically.
Yeah.
People will have seen these islands.
Stewart Island,
where it has taken place. Do we understand at all why?
No, I think there's a short and a very long answer. So I'll give you the short answer first. The short answer is no, we don't understand what's going on. The long answer is it depends. So now the kind of the work that the veterinarians are going to be able to carry out to do the autopsies of the whales that have stranded are really going to help us to understand what might have been the cause for this. Now, for that species, for these pilot whales, it's unfortunately, it's not uncommon for them to strand, and when they do, to strand a lot of them at the same time. So these guys live in what we call matrilines. So if it's a matriarchal society, if you prefer, in pilot whales. Mm-hmm. And so which means that closely knit individuals, or individuals are close to each other, the sisters and the moms and the grandmoms all live together all the time at sea. And it seems that when one strands, everybody else follows. And it could be for a range of reasons.
Like
partly
what?
If it's sick. Well, if it's sickness, it might just be that everybody is sick, essentially. So it's part of it.
But if one were sick, would the others follow?
Yeah, it seems to be the case. So that's something we've been learning really over the past 20 years or so now. It's
quite moving, really, isn't it?
It's a very old thing. People have been wondering about it for a long time. The point is that indeed, if there is only one of few individuals that are sick, it looks like the others will follow, essentially.
Nuala McGovern talking to Professor David Lusseau. It's a childhood favourite for many and one of the most watched films of all time. And now, The Wizard of Oz has been identified as the most influential film of all time. The 1939 musical, starring Judy Garland, came out top in a study of 47,000 films, ahead of Star Wars and Psycho. Oliver Conway has this report.
timeless songs, an early use of colour, and the exciting adventures of an ordinary girl swept away to a magical land. No wonder The Wizard of Oz has had such an impact on movie makers. Researchers at the University of Turin used an algorithm to explore connections between films and found The Wizard of Oz referenced on screen more times than any other movie. Critic Tim Roby isn't surprised.
It just casts such a shadow over cinema in general. There have been so many reworkings of it. Just to pick one example, David Lynch's film Wild at Heart pretty much follows the entire plot of it. But also I think it's one of those American myths that has just kind of endured. The idea of leaving the Dust Bowl and going to the kind of big bad city. It arrives at a moment in American film where colour's just coming in. It's almost the moment where colour arrives is in that very scene in Wizard of Oz where Dorothy leaves Kansas. Colour suddenly floods the screen.
And once they got a taste for colour, cinema goers wanted more. The researchers also found that films from Germany were influential in the 1930s and Italian movies in the 1960s. Most of the top 20, though, were made in the US and all produced before 1980.
Oliver Conway with that report. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Alex Ritson. Until next time, goodbye.